Welcome. Today we're going to be taking a very close look at the source material, detailing a series of events that are just profoundly tragic and also legally very complex.
Mm.
We're examining a case that really exposed some serious systemic failures across international borders involving two murders, the death of Andrew Bagby, and, tragically, the death of his infant son, Zachary Turner.
And this is a story of, just immense sorrow, but it's one that really has to be analyzed meticulously. Our goal here is to just extract the facts from the sources, the timeline of events, the disturbing pattern of behavior that we see, and of course the investigations that followed.
Right.
Because they laid bare these critical failings within the Newfoundland legal system and its child welfare system. And I think what makes this so incredibly difficult to process is the conclusion that later reviews came to. Zachary's death was entirely preventable.
That is the absolute core of what we're looking at today. We're going to trace the facts to understand how this horrific chain of events ultimately forced a significant and frankly necessary legislative reform in Canada.
Yeah.
And that reform, which was born from just unimaginable grief, remains the lasting legacy of the Bagby family.
So let's start by just identifying the victims, the people whose lives were so unjustly cut short. The first victim was Andrew David Bagby. He was an American physician, a 28-year-old medical resident from Sunnyvale, California.
So he was an only child, right?
The only child of Kathleen and David Bagby. His whole life was focused on family medicine, on service, and that path was just tragically cut short.
And his son, the second victim, was Zachary Andrew Turner. Zachary was born on July 18, 2002, and he survived for only 13 months before his life was taken on August 18, 2003.
The perpetrator in both of these crimes was Shirley Turner. She was Zachary's mother. She killed Andrew Bagby in November of 2001, and then she carried out the murder-suicide involving Zachary in August of 2003.
And it's crucial to remember, at the time of her death, she was awaiting extradition to the United States.
Yes, on charges of first-degree murder for Andrew's death. And that's where the systemic failure really lies. The fact that she was able to retain custody of her child while facing those exact charges.
So to understand how a catastrophic failure of this magnitude could even happen, we have to look closely at Shirley Turner's own history, her documented pattern of instability, manipulation, and violence. It existed long before she ever met Andrew Bagby.
The source material gives us a very detailed and deeply unsettling portrait of her. Shirley Jane Turner was born in 1961 in Newfoundland. Her father was a U.S. serviceman stationed there.
Okay.
She spent part of her childhood in Wichita, Kansas, but she returned to Newfoundland with her mother after her parents divorced.
And she pursued a career in medicine, but it was a long and kind of a winding path.
A very long path.
Yeah.
She started at Memorial University in 1980, but her academic life was just completely intertwined with a really turbulent personal life. She didn't complete her undergraduate degree until 1994.
14 years later.
14 years after enrolling, yeah. And this year earned her medical degree in 1998. And during that time, she married a longtime boyfriend in 1981 after she became pregnant. They had a son in 1982, then a daughter a few years later while she was working as a science teacher.
And then there was a second marriage in 1988, which produced another daughter in 1990. So she's navigating motherhood with 3 children, multiple relationships, all while trying to handle these rigorous medical studies.
Exactly. And this juggling act, it led to some early signs of misconduct and instability that involved her children. The sources give specific details about financial misconduct in the summer of 2000. She confessed to a relative that she had dipped into and spent her children's baby bonuses.
These were funds that were supposed to be for their education.
Specifically, they were earmarked for a scholarship fund, a secure investment for their post-secondary education. She spent them on her own living expenses and to continue funding her own doctoral education.
How does she justify that?
Well, she promised she earned big money once she finished her post-residency training and swore she'd pay it all back. But it shows a clear pattern, prioritizing her own immediate career ambitions over the long-term well-being of the children she already had.
And the sources point to even earlier issues, right? Back in 1993 with child welfare.
Yes. In October of 93, a man who was boarding in Turner's home, he went to his therapist and reported witnessing physical and emotional abuse of 2 of her children.
And social services got involved?
They did. Newfoundland social service workers interviewed the children, who described their mother as a disciplinarian. They confirmed they were subjected to spankings and beatings with a belt. Her then-husband downplayed it, but the case was closed in January 1994. And they never even spoke directly to Turner herself.
Wow. So the intervention was minimal despite these really concerning reports. And then after her second divorce in 97, it seems like she continued to prioritize her own mobility over consistent care for her kids.
Absolutely. She was granted custody of her daughter from her second marriage, and she immediately sent that daughter back to live with the father. Her other two children were sent to live with their paternal grandmother. This volatility in her personal life, it sets a critical context for the volatility that then started to show up in her professional career.
Okay, let's turn to that. Her medical professionalism issues, particularly between 1999 and 2000, during her residency, I mean, the documents from her supervising physicians they're exceptionally damning.
They really are. They reveal an individual who was just incapable of handling professional scrutiny. During her residency in St. John's, the criticism she faced was relentless. Her supervising physician detailed instances where, if she was challenged, Turner would become, and I'm quoting here, quite hostile, yelling, crying, and accusing me of treating her unfairly.
And this behavior escalated.
It did, to the point where during a remedial 3-month residency in early 2000, she missed 9 days of work, and critically, she was found to have falsified clinical reports.
Falsifying clinical reports. I mean, that's a profound breach of medical ethics, of responsibility.
It's one of the worst things you can do. And it wasn't just an internal issue, it directly impacted patient care. The sources mention one specific patient who was so unsettled by an encounter with Turner that they refused to ever return to the clinic.
So the staff had to, develop strategies just to manage her?
That's exactly right. The supervising physician noted that the staff became, quote, so concerned about Shirley Turner's approach to confrontation and the truth that we would never give her feedback or hold any major discussion with her alone.
They had to use a two-person system.
Just to avoid being isolated with her during a difficult conversation. It shows that her reactions, the anger, the accusations, the tears, they were so severe and so manipulative that they required this kind of institutional response.
And what was the physician's long-term assessment of her? That's maybe the most shocking part of this professional history.
It is. The supervisor concluded that while she could be charming, friendly, and lively, the moment she was caught in an untruth, she would become angry, accusatory, and loud. He summarized that her relationships were superficial, they lacked genuine personal commitment.
And later, he used a much stronger term.
Years later, yes. When speaking to an assessment officer about the case, that same physician retrospectively described Turner as, quote, a manipulative, guiltless psychopath.
That is an extremely serious assessment to come from a seasoned medical professional, someone who had overseen hundreds of residents. It suggests her behavior wasn't just stress or emotional volatility, but something much, much deeper.
It really provides the vital framework for understanding her capability for violence, which was tragically realized later. But this wasn't even the first time her possessive, violent tendencies had emerged. We have to discuss the Miles Doucet case, which happened before she even met Andrew Bagby.
Right, the Miles Doucet incident. It clearly establishes her capacity for obsessive stalking and physical confrontation.
The relationship began in March 1996. Doucet was 13 years younger than her, and when he eventually ended the relationship and moved away in Newfoundland, Turner's reaction was immediate and extreme. She just inundated him with phone calls. She refused to accept it was over.
And this escalated to physical violence in 1997.
It did. In November of 97, she tracked him down in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It led to a physical confrontation where she struck him in the jaw with a high-heeled shoe.
So this was assault.
It was assault. Doucet was so afraid of her that he ended up moving to the United States in 1998, just hoping to escape her.
But she followed him. She followed him to Westtown Township, Pennsylvania.
She did. And over the next year, she continued to leave him threatening voicemails. She made unannounced disruptive visits to his apartment. The source material shows that Doucet had to call state troopers repeatedly just to get her to leave his property. He explicitly told the police he genuinely feared what Dr. Turner would do next.
And then came that very dramatic, very public suicide attempt in April 1999.
Yeah, on April 7th, 1999, Doucet found her semi-conscious right outside his apartment. She had ingested 65 milligrams of over-the-counter medication. She was found wearing a black dress carrying red roses, and she had 2 suicide notes.
And one of them said?
One of them, for her psychiatrist, said, "I'm not evil, just sick." And this whole sequence of events, the stalking, the assault, the threats, and this manipulative suicide attempt, it presents an undeniable, documented history of high-risk behavior that was available to officials who would later handle her case.
And that history, the financial misconduct, the professional failure, the assessment of psychopathy, and the violence in the Doucet case, That is the essential context. This individual with this documented pattern is the person who then begins a relationship with Andrew Bagby.
And that is why the legal decisions that came later are so baffling. This history should have flagged her as a severe risk to any child placed in her care, especially when you couple it with a charge of first-degree murder.
Okay, so let's guide the narrative to the relationship with Andrew Bagby and his eventual murder in November of 2001. Turner and Bagby, who was a younger medical student at Memorial University, they began dating in early 1999, right around the time of the Ducesse suicide attempt.
They tried to have a long-distance relationship as they moved for their residencies. Bagby went to Syracuse, New York, then to Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Turner went to Iowa, and then Nebraska.
And despite that distance, the sources show Turner exhibiting the exact same possessive and obsessive behavior that she did with Doucet.
Absolutely. The disparity in their efforts is very telling. She visited his Syracuse residence 7 times, but he only visited her once. And during one of her visits to his apartment, the sources say she is believed to have burglarized his apartment, though no charges were ever laid.
And then the possessiveness escalates into outright deception with the false pregnancy claim in October of 2001.
Right. She falsely claimed she was 3 months pregnant, which was, likely an attempt to bind Bagby to her. She visited him in Latrobe later that month, but this was after she had already taken a very crucial, very ominous step. She attended her final firearms lesson in Omaha.
And they were arguing during that visit.
Constantly, over his new girlfriend.
The breakup finally happened on November 3, 2001.
Yes. Turner confessed that the pregnancy was a lie. Bagby, of course, was furious, broke up with her over lunch, and sent her back to Iowa. But what's critical is that before she ever made that trip, back in October 2001, she had obtained a permit to buy a firearm and had purchased a Phoenix Arms HT-22 handgun and .22 ammunition. The preparation for violence was already complete.
And she didn't accept the breakup. On November 4, 2001, she made 3 calls to his residence, and then she executed this massive overnight drive.
This was not a spontaneous act of passion. This was planned vengeance. She drove 1,523 kilometers, that's 946 miles, from Iowa to Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
An almost 16-hour drive.
A 16-hour drive, yeah. She arrived in the early morning of November 5, 2001, fully armed.
She confronted Bagby near his practice, and there was this critical, just agonizing moment that day where his supervisor tried to intervene.
Bagby arrived at work. He was clearly agitated, and he told his supervisor, T. Clark Simpson, that Turner had shown up unexpectedly. Simpson explicitly advised him, do not meet with her privately, understanding the potential volatility.
But he didn't listen.
Tragically, no. Bagby dismissed the advice. He promised Simpson he'd come to his house later that evening after speaking with Turner, but he never arrived.
The details of the crime itself are just brutal.
Andrew Bagby's body was found the next morning, November 6, 2001, in a parking lot at Keystone State Park in Derry Township, Pennsylvania. The wounds showed just extreme violence and malice. He'd been shot 5 times with CCI .22 caliber bullets, shots to the face, the chest, the buttocks, and the fatal shot was to the back of the head.
Immediately after the murder, Turner tried to construct this ironclad alibi from a distance, claiming she was homesick in Iowa. But investigators, they broke that down pretty quickly with electronic evidence.
They did. The cell phone records were key. They showed cross-country calls connecting her phone to the Latrobe area, placing her squarely in Pennsylvania when she claimed to be in Iowa. And not only that, she used Bagby's home computer after the estimated time of his death to access her personal email and check eBay.
She even used his phone to call in sick for herself.
She used his home phone line to call in sick to her own work, trying to establish an alibi by proxy from inside the victim's residence. Just brazen.
And when police confronted her with this, her story changed multiple times.
It did. She admitted to meeting Bagby at the park, but then she claimed he put the gun in his trunk, suggesting maybe someone else was the shooter or that he was going to harm himself. But then she told her shooting instructor that her gun had been stolen. It was a third, conflicting version of events. The physical evidence, though, was overwhelming.
What were the key pieces of physical evidence that tied her directly to that scene?
Well, first, an unspent round was recovered near Bagby's body. It was identified as CCI .22 ammunition, which was consistent with the Phoenix Arms HP-22 handgun she had purchased. Her shooting instructor confirmed that this specific type of handgun often ejects live rounds during handling, which corroborated the physical evidence.
Okay, so that's the ammunition. What else?
A resident in Derry reported seeing Bagby's Toyota Corolla parked right next to a RAV4, which matched Turner's vehicle, just minutes after Bagby made his last call to his supervisor. The next morning, only the Corolla was there.
Right.
Then investigators found MapQuest directions to Latrobe in her apartment. And finally, there was circumstantial evidence. The lot number on a box of condoms they found in her apartment matched a box that Bagby had purchased in Latrobe on the night they broke up.
So the case against her was incredibly strong. And yet, by November 12, 2001, just as authorities were securing an arrest warrant, she was gone.
She fled the United States,
Right.
flew to Toronto, and then resettled in St. John's, Newfoundland. She was effectively leveraging the border to delay and complicate the whole legal process. And that flight, it set the stage for this devastating legal and custody battle in Canada, where the system's approach just utterly failed to prioritize child safety.
So she's a wanted fugitive in the U.S. for first-degree murder, and she's back in Canada. What happened next in St. John's?
Well, the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the RNC, they quickly put her under surveillance. And on December 2, 2001, they seized her trash. And that led to a critical discovery. Ultrasound printouts dated November 29.
And they confirmed.
It confirmed she was pregnant with Andrew Bagby's child. She had conceived just prior to the murder.
So that confirmation immediately changes the landscape. It goes from a purely criminal extradition case to this high-stakes, cross-border child custody battle, a battle that the Bagbys had no choice but to join.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
She was arrested on December 12, 2001, and extradition proceedings started. But the system failure began almost immediately with the first bail decision by Newfoundland Justice Gail Welsh.
Despite the charge first-degree murder in the U.S., which is just as serious in Canada justice, Welsh decided to release Turner on bail. What was the justification for releasing a woman charged with first-degree murder?
The justice ruled that Turner, who was 40 at the time, did not pose a significant threat to society. She applied the legal standard that governs bail, the presumption of innocence. The bail was set at 75,000 Canadian dollars, and she had to surrender her passports and report weekly to the RNC.
But the core failing there was the scope of the risk assessment.
That's it. It focused so narrowly on her risk to the general public or her risk of flight. It did not adequately or really at all assess her risk to the potential unborn child.
And the funding of the bail itself became a scandal.
It did. Turner posted the bond with substantial help from her psychiatrist and former coworker, Dr. John Doucet, who was affiliated with Memorial University. For a medical professional to financially support a patient facing a first-degree murder charge, especially one with her documented history, was just. It was immediately flagged as a profound ethical breach.
And that would come back to haunt him later.
It would. It led to professional misconduct findings against him.
So the news of the pregnancy, it spurred Andrew's parents, David and Kathleen Bagby, into action. They just put their lives on hold and moved to St. John's, Newfoundland, specifically to fight for custody of their future grandchild.
Their dedication was absolutely relentless. Zachary Andrew Turner was born on July 18, 2002. And the presence of the Bagbys, it fundamentally altered the dynamics. They weren't just fighting for justice for their son anymore. They were fighting for the life and the safety of their only grandchild.
And the struggle for access, even just to see Zachary, was immediate and agonizing for them.
Oh, Turner vehemently resisted letting them see Zachary. She openly said she was afraid they would try to kidnap the infant. Her resistance was so extreme that the sources note she fired her own family law lawyer simply because he held a positive professional attitude towards the Bagbys. It just shows her absolute need for control and her paranoia.
The complexity of this legal fight must have been tremendous for them. They're running a custody case at the same time as this ongoing delayed extradition hearing for a murder charge. What arguments were the Bagbys making in the custody hearings?
They were arguing that, given Turner's history, the murder of their son, the stalking, the documented psychopathy, her extreme instability, that she was a high active risk to the child and that custody should be immediately transferred to them.
And they could provide a safe, loving, stable environment.
Exactly. And how did the court respond to this documented history of violence and instability? Well, this is where the failure becomes truly glaring. The Newfoundland legal framework at the time, it prioritized the presumption of innocence for the mother in the murder case, and that often overshadowed the assessment of risk in the custody case.
So social services were involved, but they were hamstrung.
They were struggling with the mandate. They were focused on proving Turner was unfit based on traditional criteria like neglect or poverty, rather than focusing on the unique high-level threat posed by the pending murder charges and her psychological profile.
And did social services note any issues with Zachary's development or his attachment to her?
The sources reveal some deeply concerning anecdotal evidence about that. Zachary was observed to prefer the company and attention of other adults, especially his grandparents, over his mother. This lack of a secure attachment must have been emotionally devastating for Turner and probably fed into her instability.
That emotional devastation seems to have culminated in a really stark, really revealing comment at Zachary's first birthday party in July 2003.
Yes. At a McDonald's in St. John's, Turner was watching the interaction between Kathleen Bagby and Zachary. And she made this chilling statement to Kathleen. He obviously loves you more than me, so why don't you take him?
And this was just weeks before the murder-suicide.
Weeks. It shows a mother who was emotionally collapsing under the weight of it all. The custody battle, the pending extradition, and the rejection by her own son.
Before we get to that final tragedy, there was the second catastrophic failure of the system, the second bail decision in January 2003. Turner had been re-jailed in November 2002, awaiting the federal justice minister's decision on her extradition. So why was she released again?
Justice Welch released her again. And this time, the rationale really cemented the legal system's failure to protect Zachary. Justice Welch reiterated that the murder was not directed at the public at large.
Not directed at the public at large. What does that mean in this context?
It's a crucial legal distinction. She was essentially saying that because Andrew was known to Turner, she wasn't a random threat to society. And therefore, that reduced the perceived risk of flight or further public violence.
So the court was prioritizing this narrow legal standard presumption of innocence regarding the public threat over the explicit, immediate danger to the vulnerable child in her sole custody.
Exactly. The fact that the murder involved the father of the child and that Turner had this history of violence stemming from intimate relationships, that should have elevated the risk to Zachary exponentially. But the court failed to establish a legal framework that required judges to place a child's safety above a mother's right to liberty while awaiting extradition for a capital crime.
They just failed to connect the dots. Her history of relationship violence and obsessive behavior, they didn't connect it directly to her capacity to harm her own child when she was facing loss.
They didn't. And that decision allowed a woman awaiting extradition for first-degree murder, with a documented history of violence and a personality disorder, to retain full legal custody of her 1-year-old son. It set the clock ticking on the final agonizing 7 months of Zachary's life.
It's just a profound textbook example of how a legal technicality can have lethal consequences when it's applied without enough consideration for the safety of a child who is directly connected to the victim and the alleged perpetrator. Let's move to the tragic end of this timeline. 7 months after that second bail decision, August 18th, 2003, Zachary, age 1, was scheduled to be in his mother's custody.
Turner first visited a St. John's pharmacy to purchase her prescription of lorazepam. Lorazepam is a potent benzodiazepine. It's a central nervous system depressant.
And she used this drug to carry out the murder-suicide.
She mixed the lorazepam into Zachary's baby formula, making sure he ingested a toxic dosage. And then she ingested a large toxic dosage herself.
After that, she took the infant to Foxtrot Marina in Conception Bay South.
She strapped the 13-month-old infant to her chest using her sweater. With Zachary secured to her, she jumped off a fishing wharf at the Foxtrot Marina into the frigid Atlantic Ocean.
And the findings. They confirm the nature of their deaths.
Turner died by drowning. For Zachary, the post-mortem analysis determined that the lorazepam had rendered him unconscious before he was submerged. And that medical detail provides the only minimal possible comfort that he didn't suffer the terrifying sensation of drowning.
Turner's body was discovered on a nearby beach by a vacationing couple. Zachary's body was found nearby. And their fight for custody, a fight that had consumed every single aspect of David and Kathleen Bagby's lives for 2 years, it ended on a concrete dock overlooking the ocean. The loss of their only child and their only grandchild was absolute.
This tragedy just underscores the immense cost of systemic failure. Had the legal system intervened at any point at the first bail hearing, or certainly at the second, Zachary would have been safe with his devoted grandparents. And their grief then became the powerful necessary catalyst for reform.
Let's transition now to analyzing the official investigations that followed and the lasting positive legacy that was driven by the Bagby family. First, the professional misconduct finding against John Doucet.
Right. In May of 2006, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Newfoundland and Labrador found Dr. John Doucet, Turner's psychiatrist, guilty of professional misconduct. This charge came specifically from his illegal act of helping Turner post that $75,000 bail bond. It blurred the professional lines between doctor and patient, and he was aiding an accused murderer.
And what were the repercussions for him?
He was fined $10,000, which was about one-third of the cost of the inquiry into his conduct. He was also ordered to undergo psychiatric counseling. And while the Bagdys felt the punishment was maybe too light for the consequences, they did acknowledge it set a valuable precedent about the ethical obligations of professionals.
But the more significant analysis came with the Turner Review and Investigation in October 2006. This report, by a Winnipeg-based coroner named Peter Markestein, was highly critical.
The Markestein Review is a really thorough look at the provincial systems involved, and it concluded definitively that Zachary's death was preventable. And this wasn't just a general statement. It systematically identified precisely where the Newfoundland and Labrador social services system had failed to protect the child.
What were the specific detailed failings cited in that report?
Markestein cited 4 major shortcomings that really reveal a bureaucratic confusion and a systemic lack of prioritization. First, there was poor communication between officials, between social workers, police, and the court system. Information about Turner's documented history or the active extradition efforts, it just wasn't being seamlessly shared or cross-referenced.
And the second point is probably the most damning because it relates right back to the court's rationale for bail.
It does. The report found there was a consistent focus on presuming Shirley Turner's innocence and expressing concern for her welfare, rather than prioritizing Zachary's immediate safety needs. The system seemed paralyzed by the principle of innocent until proven guilty in the murder case, even though that presumption shouldn't negate the need for rigorous child protection measures in a parallel custody case.
What about the assessment of Zachary himself?
Markestein pointed to a demonstrable lack of ongoing assessment of the child's safety needs. He stated it explicitly in the report. Nowhere did I find any ongoing assessment of the safety needs of the children. Caseworkers were not routinely mandated to evaluate the specific, unique risks posed by a parent awaiting murder extradition who exhibited such severe instability.
And finally, the internal environment within the social services agencies just made the problem worse.
The report noted that internal disagreements between caseworkers and managers were not openly discussed. So caseworkers who had concerns weren't always empowered or encouraged to escalate them. Markestein concluded that the complexity and the high risk of this case should have triggered a mandate for intervention by an outside agency.
And the provincial government? They accepted the report's conclusions and committed to implementing all 29 recommendations. That's a huge systemic overhaul, stemming directly from Zachary's death.
It speaks to the gravity of the failures that were exposed. But the Bagbys, they realized that social services reform was only half the battle. The core legal problem, the judicial latitude that allowed the bail releases that needed federal legislative action.
David and Kathleen Bagby relentlessly advocated for this legal reform. David Bagby documented their experience in his 2007 book, Dance with the Devil, a memoir of murder and loss.
And their activism culminated on October 23, 2009, with the introduction of Bill C-464 by MP Scott Andrews. This bill quickly became known universally as Zachary's Bill.
What exactly did Zachary's bill change about Canadian law? How did it directly address that loophole that Justice Welsh had used?
It fundamentally strengthened bail conditions in the Canadian Criminal Code. Before the bill, judges were primarily focused on assessing the risk of flight or the risk to the public at large. Zachary's bill introduced a specific new provision allowing judges to refuse bail to those accused of serious crimes when that refusal is necessary to protect the well-being and safety of a child.
So this crucial change mandated that judges could, and in high-risk cases must, explicitly consider the child as a vulnerable individual, distinct from the general public.
Precisely. It elevated the safety of the child, especially when the accused has committed a violent crime against the child's other parent, above the accused's right to liberty pending trial. It was a direct legislative remedy to the judicial reasoning that let Turner walk free. The idea that the murder was not directed at the public at large could no longer negate the risk to the child.
The political support for this was striking. It received unanimous support in the Canadian House of Commons and Senate.
It crossed all political lines because the failure was so universally recognized as tragic and obvious. After passing both houses, it was signed into law on December 16, 2010. MP Scott Andrews noted that the law gave the Bagbys some sense that their cries had finally been heard, ensuring this specific legislative vacuum would never lead to such a tragedy again.
Beyond the legal reforms, the case also has this powerful documentation legacy through the arts. It ensures that Andrew and Zachary are remembered not just as statistics of a preventable crime.
Yes, the 2008 documentary film, Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father, directed by Kurt Kuhn, who was a lifelong friend of Andrew Bagby, It's a critical document. The film was originally conceived as a cinematic letter to Zachary, collecting stories from Andrew's friends and family so the child would know his father.
But the film's narrative then took a devastating turn.
It did. Kian was filming in Newfoundland, and he met Zachary in July 2003. He documented his first birthday just 1 month before the murder-suicide. So the film transforms from this tribute to a deceased father into a heartbreaking record of the systemic failure that led to the death of the son.
And it received immense critical acclaim.
It did. It won awards.
Yeah.
I was named one of the top documentaries of 2008, and it really cemented its place as this poignant record of the tragedy.
And finally, their enduring legacy continues through the establishment of 2 scholarships in their names.
2 positive beacons established in tribute. The first is the Dr. Andrew David Bagby Family Medicine Scholarship, which benefits medical students pursuing family practice at Excella Health Latrobe Hospital, where Andrew had been training. And the second is the Dr. Andrew Bagby and Son Zachary Bursary Fund, which supports students at Memorial University of Newfoundland, the place where Andrew and Shirley first met. These scholarships ensure their names are associated with education and opportunity, rather than just the horror of their deaths.
We've charted this path from a personal tragedy to a massive systemic failure, culminating in the death of an innocent child. And the sheer determination and courage of David and Kathleen Bagby in the face of just unimaginable loss, they managed to channel their immense grief into a powerful and necessary force for legislative change in Canada.
Yeah, if we look at this story in the context of the bigger picture, the case provides a chilling illustration of this inherent conflict. The conflict between the fundamental legal principle of the presumption of innocence and the immediate paramount legal and moral obligation to protect vulnerable children from known risks. The system failed, not because there was a lack of data on Shirley Turner's volatility, but because there was a failure in prioritizing which legal principle carried the greater weight when a child's life was on the line.
And the legislative reform, Zachary's bill, addressed the court's ability to deny bail in these critical circumstances. But the institutional failures, they went beyond the courts. They reached into social services and medical professional licensing bodies who also had these critical fragmented pieces of information about Turner.
And that brings us to our final thought for your own reflection. Given the extensive documented background regarding Shirley Turner's professional misconduct, her history of violence toward Miles Doucet, the retrospective psychopathic diagnosis, and all the clear signs of her mental and emotional instability, all of which were known to various officials before Zachary was even born, what specific institutional checks, beyond just the bail laws established by Zachary's bill, could have been mandated?
You mean things like stronger mandatory reporting laws? Or some kind of cross-institutional risk flagging between medical licensing bodies and child protective services?
Exactly. Could something like that have been implemented to guarantee the safety of her son, regardless of the pending criminal trial?
That is the critical, lingering question. It speaks to the need for seamless communication and proactive risk assessment across all agencies when an individual poses such a clear, documented threat.
Thank you for joining us for this comprehensive exploration of the source material.
Thanks for listening.